The night Irene Calloway saw the face on the television screen. She was sitting alone in the kitchen of the house she had kept after the divorce. The house in Oakville with the bay window and the stone fireplace and the drawer full of takeout menus she never used anymore. She had poured herself a glass of Pinot Gris and was only half watching the local news, the way people watch things when they are not really watching at all. Then the segment changed. The host introduced the next guest as the founder of Hamilton's fastest-growing independent catering company. A man in a clean gray shirt walked on camera. He had the same posture Irene remembered, slightly forward, like he was always ready to help someone carry something heavy. His hair had gone more silver at the temples. There were new lines around his eyes. Her wineglass tilted. She caught it before it fell. But the stem left a small red ring on the kitchen island, on top of the financial reports she had been reviewing, on top of the papers she had spent the past 2 years building into a portfolio that proved, at least to herself, that she had made the right decision, that she had been the one going somewhere, that leaving had been practical, not cruel. The man on the television was Fletcher Morrow, her ex-husband, the man she had walked out on 18 months ago, leaving him the rented half of the duplex on Cannon Street, a 7-year-old pickup truck, and somewhere in the neighborhood of $400 that she had calculated honestly was his fair share. She had thought that was the end of his story. She had been wrong about a great many things. Fletcher Morrow had not been a man anyone would look at twice on the street. That had always been true, and he had never seemed to mind. He was 53 years old, broad-shouldered in a way that came from actual work rather than a gym membership, and he wore the same rotating set of flannels and canvas jackets he had owned for the better part of a decade. His truck, a 2009 GMC Sierra the color of old mustard, had a cracked dashboard and no functioning passenger side window crank, and he drove it without any apparent embarrassment. He had worked for 19 years as a facilities manager at a mid-size manufacturing company out in Stony Creek. He kept the building running. He knew which pipes were going to fail before they failed, which contractors were reliable and which ones weren't, which union rep would actually return a call on a Friday afternoon. He was not glamorous work. He understood this. What people who did not know Fletcher Morrow well tended to miss was that he cooked, not in a hobbyist way, not the kind of weekend barbecue performance that men of a certain age sometimes use to seem more interesting at parties. He cooked the way some people build furniture or tune engines, with patience, with precision, with a level of quiet satisfaction that didn't require an audience. His grandmother, Agnes, had kept a kitchen in a farmhouse outside of Guelph that smelled perpetually of rendered fat and wood smoke, and from the age of 7 Fletcher had spent his summer afternoons at the counter beside her, learning things she never wrote down. The difference between suet and lard, the moment a roux turns, why you finish a braise with vinegar, not with salt. He had a notebook, a soft-covered Hilroy that he had carried for years, filling it with recipes in his own cramped handwriting, sometimes with notes in the margins that had nothing to do with cooking. Observations about timing, reminders about patience, the occasional sentence from something he had read that seemed, for reasons he couldn't always explain, important to keep. Irene had always found the notebook faintly eccentric. She kept her own notes in apps, in spreadsheets, in cloud folders organized by year and category. She was a project manager at a commercial real estate firm, and she was good at it, efficient and precise and always 3 steps ahead of the current problem. She had married Fletcher Morrow when she was 36, and she had believed for a long time that what she admired in him was his steadiness, the way he was always there, the way nothing seemed to rattle him. Later, she would tell herself that was exactly the problem. That steadiness had started to feel after a while like inertia. She had been moving forward. Promotions, a growing network, a seat on a condo board, dinner with people who talked about things that mattered. Fletcher had been making stock from vegetable trimmings on Sunday afternoons. She met someone at a professional development conference in Toronto. His name was not important. What mattered was that he was ambitious in a visible way, the kind of ambitious that looks like momentum when you're standing close enough to it. She made her decision in the spring. She did not tell Fletcher she was unhappy. Later, when she tried to examine why, she couldn't arrive at a clean answer. Partly, she told herself, she had not wanted to argue. Partly, and this was the part she examined less, She had known that if she gave him the chance to respond, he would have responded with the kind of quiet reasonableness that was very difficult to argue against. The divorce was handled through mediators. Irene had done her research, and she was thorough. The house in Oakville, which she had inherited from her parents, was already in her name. The savings account they held jointly had been, over the preceding 8 months, drawn down for what she had documented as shared household expenses. Fletcher had not tracked these things. He had trusted her to track them. By the time the paperwork was completed, what remained was the truck, the duplex rental, and the $400. Fletcher signed without disputing any of it. That, more than anything, should have told her something. He moved back to the East End, to the duplex on Cannon Street. He had a friend from the facilities job, a man named Roy who had a spare room and a detached garage and no particular objection to company. Fletcher paid what he could in rent and, in exchange, cooked most of the meals. He kept going to work. He kept the building running. He got up at 5:30 every morning, and he did what needed to be done. And he did not, as far as anyone could tell, fall apart. What he did in the evenings was cook. The duplex had a functional kitchen, nothing remarkable, a gas range that Roy had bought secondhand, decent counter space. Fletcher began working through the notebook systematically, things he had meant to try for years and hadn't. Agnes's Christmas pie, a lamb shoulder braise with juniper and black currant that he had sketched out in the margins a decade ago and never tested. A sourdough that took 4 days to develop properly and tasted when he pulled it from the oven on a Thursday night, exactly like something he remembered but could not name. Roy's co-workers started appearing at dinner. Then their partners. Then, somehow, people Roy did not know particularly well, who had heard something, and arrived on a Saturday afternoon with a bottle of wine and a polite inquiry about whether there was any of that lamb left. Fletcher fed them. He did not think of it as anything other than feeding people. It was Roy who suggested the market. Dundas Street Farmers Market ran on Saturday mornings from June through October, and Roy knew the organizer through a hockey league connection. He thought Fletcher could get a table. Fletcher said he didn't see why anyone would pay for the food when they could get it for free on Saturday afternoons, and Roy said that was not really how the world worked, Fletcher, and also that he had eaten 4 of those lamb dumplings while Fletcher wasn't looking and he needed to be stopped from eating more. Fletcher applied for a vendor spot. He got one at the far end of the market near the parking lot, which was not the premium location. He spent $60 of the $400 on a folding table and a second-hand propane burner. He made a triple batch of his grandmother's short rib stew, packed it in a borrowed stock pot, and drove to the market at 6:15 on a Saturday morning in June. By 9 o'clock, the pot was empty. He had not brought enough. That was the first lesson. He had brought what he thought would last a 5-hour market, and it lasted 3. He turned people away after 9. A woman in a yellow raincoat, the kind of practical raincoat people in Hamilton wore not for fashion, but because it was actually raining, asked him if he was coming back next week, and he said he supposed he was, and she said good because she wanted 2 of those and also whatever that other thing had been. He went home and made notes and started cooking again Sunday afternoon. The second Saturday he brought twice as much. It lasted until 11:30. He ran out again. By August, he had a 6-week waiting list for catered orders that he was not yet technically set up to fulfill. A woman who organized corporate lunches in the downtown core had stopped by the table in week 3 and handed him a card. He had looked at the card for a long time and then called her back 3 days later because he was not a person who made quick decisions, and they had talked for an hour about logistics and food safety certifications and what volume she was actually thinking about. And at the end of the conversation, he had not said yes. He had said he needed to think about it. He thought about it for 1 week. Then he said yes. The certifications took 3 months. He did the coursework evenings and weekends while still working at the facilities job. He researched commercial kitchen rentals. He found a shared-use kitchen space in an industrial unit on Burlington Street, booked by the hour, licensed for catering production, and began making arrangements. He did the arithmetic carefully, the way he did most things, on paper with a pencil. He had approximately $340 left. He knew what he needed first and what could wait. He told no one except Roy, and Roy, to his credit, simply asked what he could do to help and then did it without additional commentary. The first corporate lunch was for 22 people at an investment consulting firm on King Street. Fletcher drove the food over in the Sierra with the containers strapped down in the truck bed and carried everything up 2 flights of stairs himself because the freight elevator was being serviced. He set up in the boardroom kitchenette and served from there. He had made 3 things: a white bean and ham soup, a sliced roast pork with apple and fennel, and a butter tart that was his grandmother's recipe with the filling ratio adjusted twice based on tests he had run the previous month. The consultant who had hired him came back to the kitchenette at the end and asked how much it would cost to do this every other week. By the following February, he had left the facilities job. He had not meant to leave so quickly. The plan had been to run both for another 6 months to save more of a cushion, to be careful. But the consulting firm had referred him to 2 other firms, and one of those firms had a board dinner in January that had gone very well, and by February the number of booked weeks had crossed a threshold that made working 2 jobs simultaneously unreasonable. He gave his notice on a Thursday. His supervisor, a man named Dennis, who had worked alongside him for 11 years, shook his hand and said he wasn't surprised. Fletcher said he was, a little. Dennis said that was typical of him and offered to be a reference. The company name was almost an accident. Roy had suggested Morrow's Table. Fletcher had thought about it and said it felt like it was trying too hard. He called it Agnes after his grandmother. He had it painted on the side of a secondhand white cargo van he bought in March. Agnes, Catering and Events, Hamilton, Ontario. The lettering was simple and clean, done by a sign painter in Dundas, whose shop had been there since 1987. He used the notebook every day. By spring it was showing its wear. The cover soft and creased, the pages warped from the kitchen humidity. He bought a second notebook, the same kind, and began transferring recipes, but he kept the original. It was not something he had planned to be sentimental about. He just couldn't bring himself to throw it away. The regional food magazine ran a piece in May. A writer had been at one of the corporate events and had followed up on her own. Fletcher had not sought out press, had not hired anyone to manage his profile, did not have professional photographs of his food or a website that did anything other than list a contact number. The writer had found the number through the Hamilton Farmers Market website and called him directly, and he had answered because he answered most calls. The piece was titled, "Quiet on the Outside." It ran 4 pages with photographs shot in the Burlington Street kitchen. The notebook appeared in one of the photographs, open on the counter between the soup pot and a tray of tarts, the handwriting visible, some of the margin notes legible if you looked closely. Fletcher read the piece once, put the magazine on the counter, and went back to preparing for a Friday delivery. Roy read it 3 times and put it on the refrigerator with a magnet. The local television segment came in the late summer, the outgrowth of the magazine piece. A producer called about doing a short feature on Hamilton food entrepreneurs. Fletcher had said he wasn't sure he qualified as an entrepreneur, and the producer had said he thought that was probably the most entrepreneurial thing anyone had said to her in 6 months, and could she come by the kitchen on Thursday? He said yes. The segment aired on a Wednesday evening in September. In Oakville, Irene Calloway set down her wine glass and stood in the kitchen for a long time after the segment ended. The man in the conference room, the one who had seemed like momentum from a certain distance, had turned out to be something different up close. The relationship had lasted 14 months. She did not blame him entirely. She had been, she understood in retrospect, looking for something she had not correctly identified, and he had seemed like it without actually being it. She had the house, she had the career. She had the portfolio and the professional contacts and the seat on the condo board. She was not unhappy, exactly. She was a person who was good at being not unhappy, who could organize her life so that the empty spaces were filled with things that looked like contentment. But she was standing in the kitchen at 9 o'clock on a Wednesday night with a wine ring on her financial reports and the image of Fletcher Morrow's face on her television, and she found she could not immediately think of a single useful thing to do next. She picked up her phone. She set it back down. She thought about the way he had always kept the kitchen clean when he was done. The way he had never once left a dish for morning. She had found that unremarkable at the time, even, occasionally, faintly irritating in the way that someone else's diligent habits can be irritating when you are looking for something to be irritated by. She thought about the Sunday afternoons when the apartment would fill with the smell of something long and slow on the stove, and how she had sometimes sat at the kitchen table with her laptop and worked while it cooked, and how that had been, without her fully registering it, a very good way to spend a Sunday afternoon. She poured the rest of the wine down the sink and went to bed. She did not sleep for a long time. 3 days later, she drove to the Hamilton Farmers Market. It was a Saturday morning, the second week of October, one of the last markets before the season ended. She had looked up the address. She had not called ahead. She was not sure what she intended to say. She only knew that showing up without calling felt more honest than the alternative. Fletcher Morrow was not at the market. He had not had a regular table since June. The catering volume had made weekend markets impractical, and he had handed his spot to a younger vendor selling preserves. There was a sign with the Agnes logo on the table, a small cardboard card with the website and number, but no Fletcher. Irene stood in the market for a while. Around her, people were buying bread and root vegetables and the last of the season's apples. A man was selling aged cheddar from a farm in Perth County. 2 children were arguing over a cinnamon bun. She bought a small jar of apple butter from the young woman at the preserve table, more out of something to do with her hands than out of want. She drove home. She thought about calling for a week. She composed versions of what she might say and discarded them. Too apologetic. Not apologetic enough. Too much explanation, as though she could account and manage her way through it. Not enough explanation, as though it was a casual check-in. She did not call. What happened instead was that she ran into Dennis, Fletcher's old supervisor from the facilities job, at a charity golf tournament in November that her firm sponsored every year. They had met twice, years ago, at work functions. Denny remembered her. He was easy, social, the kind of man who remembered faces and names and kept track of people loosely but genuinely. She asked, almost without deciding to, how Fletcher was doing. Dennis smiled, not unkindly. He said Fletcher was doing exactly what it turned out he had always been going to do, and that it had just taken some things shifting around for it to become clear. She understood that this was not quite an answer, and also entirely an answer. She said she had seen the television segment. Dennis said yes, a lot of people had. She drove home from the golf tournament and sat in the car in the driveway for a few minutes before going inside. The stone fireplace was going. She had set it before she left a timer on the gas, and the house was warm when she opened the door. It was a good house. She had always known it was a good house. She went to the kitchen, opened her laptop, and navigated to the Agnes website. There was a contact form and a phone number. There was also a gallery. Photographs of food, mostly, and one photograph she recognized from the magazine piece. The kitchen counter, the soup pot, the tray of tarts, and the open notebook with the handwriting visible. She looked at the notebook for a long time. She did not reach out that night. Fletcher Morrow was not naive. He knew who had seen the television segment. He had received through the business contact form a message from an address he recognized. Irene's professional email, the one that ended with her company domain, that said only that she had seen the piece and that it looked like things were going well, and that she hoped he was okay. He read it twice. Then he closed the laptop and went back to the kitchen, where he had a delivery prep to finish. He thought about her, on and off, over the following weeks. He was not angry. He had examined this about himself carefully in the months after the divorce, because he felt he should be angry and wasn't, and he had wanted to understand whether the absence of anger was dignity or denial. What he had concluded, after a while, was that anger required a belief that the other person had acted against their own nature. Irene had not done that. She had acted exactly in accordance with what she was. He had simply, for a long time, told himself a different story about what that was. He did not respond to the message, not because he wished her ill. He did not, but because there was nothing true he could say that would be of use to either of them. She had written to tell him she had seen him succeed. He had received the message. That seemed like enough. In December, a regional catering industry award was announced. A new category, Small Business of the Year, from the Hamilton Chamber of Commerce. Agnes Catering was on the short list. Fletcher learned about it when his accountant called to congratulate him, which was not how he had expected to receive the news. The ceremony was in late January, at the convention center on King Street. Roy bought a new shirt for the occasion. Fletcher wore the gray shirt from the television segment because Roy told him it had already worked once. Agnes did not win the award. A restaurant group from the Stony Creek end of town won it. A family operation. 3 brothers, who had been at it for 7 years and deserved the recognition. Fletcher shook the eldest brother's hand afterward and meant it. He was not competitive in a way that required him to win in order to feel that something had been worthwhile. He had learned this about himself early and considered it, on balance, a useful quality. What he won the following spring was a contract with the University Alumni Relations Office to cater 4 annual events: convocation reception, homecoming weekend, the donor appreciation dinner, and a midwinter fundraiser. It was the largest contract Agnes had taken on. He hired 2 people, a sous chef named Patience, who had spent 3 years in a commercial kitchen in Mississauga and wanted to come home to Hamilton, and a coordinator named Bruce, who had done event logistics for a hotel and understood what that work actually required. He moved to a larger shared kitchen space, one with 2 prep stations and a walk-in cold room. He told Patience on her first week that she should feel free to bring her own ideas to the menu. She had looked at him for a moment, a look of mild assessment, the kind experienced cooks give when they are determining whether an employer means what they say, and then pulled a small notebook from her coat pocket and set it on the counter. He recognized the gesture. He said nothing. He simply nodded. By the second summer, Agnes was operating year-round, and Fletcher had moved out of Roy's duplex into a rented house on Hess Street, a narrow Victorian with a proper kitchen and a small backyard where he grew tomatoes and herbs in raised beds he built himself over a May-long weekend. He drove the Sierra to the hardware store for lumber, and drove it back with the boards hanging over the tailgate, and built the beds in an afternoon, and planted everything the following weekend. Roy came over for the first Sunday dinner in the new house. Fletcher made Agnes's Christmas pie, which was not a Christmas pie in the traditional sense, but a deep-dish savory affair with venison and root vegetables, and a rough short crust that had to be made by hand or it lost something. Roy ate 2 pieces and said he was genuinely unsure how Fletcher had been allowed to spend 20 years just fixing pipes when he had this in him. Fletcher said he hadn't been allowed or not allowed. He'd just been doing one thing at a time. Roy said that was the most Fletcher Morrow thing he had ever heard anyone say. The magazine ran a follow-up piece in the 3rd autumn, 2 years after the first one. It was longer, and it went into the history more carefully. The early market mornings, the Burlington Street kitchen, the notebook. A sidebar named the piece after the notebook itself, calling it the Hilroy on the counter. The photograph they used for the cover was a simple one. Fletcher standing at the prep station in his kitchen, the notebook open in front of him, looking down at it rather than at the camera, and the light coming in through the high industrial window behind him in a way that was more or less accidental, but looked, in print, like something a photographer would have planned. He did not see the cover before it went to print. When the magazine arrived, he looked at it for a moment, stood in the small foyer of the Hess Street house, with the delivery still in its plastic sleeve, and then set it on the kitchen table and went to check on the braise that had been going since morning. Patience saw it later, when she stopped by to drop off some paperwork. She set the magazine upright against the fruit bowl in the middle of the table, cover facing out, and said nothing about it. It was still there a week later. Fletcher had not moved it, and he had not thrown it away. The notebook was on the counter beside the stove where it always was.